Welcome to Science Fiction 101, the podcast series where we explore the science fiction field from all angles, covering the past, the present, and the future. We're your hosts. I'm Phil.
And I'm Colin.
And it's celebration time. We are 10. 10 what? I hear you cry. We are 10 episodes old.
Wow. 10 months. Wow.
Well, I don't even know if it's 10 months. It's 10 episodes. Because we've sort of averaged, I suppose, about once every 3 weeks. I can't remember the start date of this. But anyway, 10 episodes. Now, I thought we should theme the entire show around the number 10. But then I thought again, because I struggled to find science fictional things that had anything connected to 10. But I made a list of things. I don't know if you've heard of any of these. There's the TV series Ben 10. Do you know that one? Yes.
Cartoon Network.
Yeah. There's 10 Years, which I think is a Hong Kong dystopian movie. Don't know if you've seen that one.
No.
What about The 10th Victim?
Yes, that's a short story by Robert Shackelford?
Sheckley, actually.
Sheckley.
Yeah. Well, the story is The 7th Victim, but when they made a film of it, they called it The 10th Victim.
Yep.
So a bit of inflation there. 10 Cloverfield Lane.
Oh, yes.
Which I haven't seen, but I know of. There's a book by Alex Harrow called The 10,000 Doors of January. And then it gets a bit tenuous after. Oh, a bit tenuous, if you see what I did there after that. I've got 2010, the year we made contact, the film. There's on the USS Enterprise in Next Generation, the bar is called 10 Forward. And then I'm really struggling for things, and I've got Bicentennial Man, Joe Haldeman's story Tricentennial, and then the film Existence, and then that palindromic film Tenet, which is 10 both ways, you see.
Yes.
So, but yeah, clearly that doesn't go anywhere, so let's not celebrate 10. Maybe when we get to 100 or something, we could do that.
I don't know if 100 is going to be any better than 10 was. Numbers in titles are rare.
That's true, yeah. Last time, of course, we talked about 2001, A Space Odyssey, and we had some comments from Emmanuel, who's one of our regular listeners. He tweeted in response to the previous episode, and he said that his experience of watching 2001 is closer to mine, Phil's, than to Colin's. In that he first saw it on DVD, which he rented from his local video store, he says, and then he saw it in letterboxed format on TV, which was something I referred to. And then he says, I was a teenager and found it boring if beautiful. And then, I think that's a fair description, isn't it?
Yeah, I remember the first time I watched it, to go back to it, but just being entranced by it, but on a rewatch, it was like, I know all this, and it's really slow getting there. And maybe I've become less patient as I've grown older. Possibly.
Emmanuel goes on to say that he also has the 4K version, which I was raving about, and says how important a big screen is to watching it. And then he says that his appreciation of visual media grew over the years, probably because of his interest in photography. And then, this is the bit I found amusing, he said, I find it interesting how two sci-fi aficionados can evolve in opposite ways in that regard. I think he's talking about you and me there, Colin.
Probably.
Sci-fi aficionados. And the final thing Emmanuel points out is that the film was shot in 70mm, not 35mm, and that's why it looks so sharp and grainless compared to other movies of that era. And that's absolutely right. Kubrick was really far-sighted in making the film. By shooting it on 70mm, he kind of future-proofed it, really, and that's why it does still look so good after all these years. But he was also doing that for a very practical reason, and that was so that the visual effects wouldn't suffer through the kind of generation loss that you get when you do visual effects. But it went further than that. When they were making the film, a lot of the visual effects they did in camera. So they would... you sometimes have to do double exposures to put one element on top of another.
Right.
And the traditional way of doing that is you film the two elements separately, put those 2 bits of film into an optical printer and print onto a third piece of film, and in the process you lose a lot of quality. But what they did mostly on 2001 is they did everything in camera. So they would do the first exposure, then they would rewind the film and do the second exposure onto the original negative. It's a very risky process, but it produces spectacular results if it works. So a lot of forward thinking and a lot of planning and so on. And it pays off because the film still looks fantastic today.
Well, even being digitized in various formats, and that's not something that typically happens.
That's very true, yeah. And I'll have something else to say about 2001 later on, but in a different context. Colin, tell us something about Hollow Earths.
Well, I'd realized that we hadn't talked about a sci-fi trope for a while, and I was racking my brain, and I thought about this, and I thought about that, and I thought, Hollow Earth. I'd been doing a little bit of reading recently about Hollow Earth stuff, and pitched it to you, and you were accepting of it. So Hollow Earth is the idea that there is actual other planets inside of the Earth, or significant civilizations that have been there for millennia or longer, as a matter of fact. Yeah. And it's rooted in the mythology all around the world. You can find dwarves lived underground, fairy mounds from Britain, the Christian version of hell, the Israeli version Sheol, the Greek underworld, Shambhala from Tibet. Native American myths also have the idea of a hollow earth, or civilizations that were inside the earth. Yeah. And that's just kind of been subsumed into 2 other categories of books, one of which is science fiction. So if you want, you can find stories about UFOs that are based inside the Earth, or Nazi civilizations, which is where they went after the fall of the Third Reich.
Well, of course.
Utopian societies, dystopian societies, monsters, lizard people, alien ant intelligences, just about anything you want. And because it's science fiction, you would expect that. The thing I did not expect was that there would be a very robust pseudo-scientific community built up around modern day interpretations of the Hollow Earth.
So this is a little bit like flat earthers then, I guess.
You'd think they'd be like diametrically opposed.
Well, yeah.
But although maybe the Hollow Earthers are they're built in layers and it's cylindrical instead of being flat. I don't know. It's flat Earths all the way down. Hollow Earths all the way down.
Wow. As far as I know, all of the Hollow Earth theories, both the sort of the pseudo-scientific ones and the mythic ones, all do seem to assume that the Earth is a sphere, don't they? I mean,
they do.
Yeah, I mean, you jokingly referred to cylinders, but I've not read that anybody has ever posited that the Earth is a cylinder. So it's interesting.
Yeah, it dates back to Sir Edmund Halley. Halley, who said, that the Earth was a series of concentric spheres. And the more curious part are some of these theories actually believe that there is another sun inside the Earth.
Yes, now I read about that, and I thought, how weird, because wouldn't it be rather hot if there was a sun inside the Earth? But maybe that's part of the theory.
Yeah, although I don't think people stop to think about, there's the scientific theory of a Dyson sphere, and solar system and galactic scale civilizations, where I want to say it's the type... I'm going to do this off the top of my head and be wrong. I want to say the Type 2 Kardashev civilization is one that is able to completely capture the output of its sun.
Right, yeah.
Using a Dyson sphere. And so when you think about the continuous emission of energy over a long period of time, it can't happen.
Yeah, that's right. But if we go back to I suppose the 17th century or the 18th century, when Halley was putting forward the idea and other people were putting forward these ideas for the first time. In those days, they thought that the sun was just burning. There was no concept that it was this atomic fireball that would go on for millions and millions of years. They just thought it was literally burning and therefore was not as hot as we now know that it is. And I suppose on that model, it might be plausible that there could be one of those in the middle of the Earth. But I wonder where they got the idea from that there would be a sun down there. Is it simply that they thought, well, if there are people down there, they must have some daylight, so there's got to be a sun? Is that the logic, or is there something else?
Yeah, I think just, as a source of light and heat, it basically. They can't imagine truly subterranean living.
Right, even though we have creatures like moles, for instance, which clearly do live underground and don't have sight.
No.
Moles are famously blind.
Yeah, Suzanne Collins wrote a short series of books for young adults called Gregor the Overlander.
Uh-huh.
And that posits a group of people that went underground in the United States and created their own civilization. And then a modern-day young man falls down a dryer vent and ends up landing there. And, most of their light is provided by luminous fungus.
Right, and I think, doesn't that happen in Journey to the Centre of the Earth? Isn't there some... Well, I know they find mushrooms in Journey to the Centre of the Earth. Don't they find a source of light down there as well, which isn't the sun, but something else? I can't remember.
I think you're right, although it's been long enough since I've read it that I don't remember.
Yeah. I looked up some things about this as well, and because I was curious as to whether there ever was a scientific basis to all of this. And as you say, Edmund Halley was somebody who posited a hollow Earth. But I was very curious about the science, because Halley is the man who predicted... Well, he's famous for Halley's Comet, of course. So he was the person who took Isaac Newton's theories, mathematical theories about how things move, and worked out that this comet ought to come back at a certain time. And of course it did. And that's why he's famous to this day. So I was curious about what was he trying to prove by suggesting a hollow Earth. But apparently what it was that there were known to be anomalies in the gravitational field of the Earth. So some parts had stronger gravity than others, and also possibly magnetism. The magnetic field of the Earth wasn't uniform. And so his idea was that the hollowness explained those anomalies, if you see what I mean. But apparently there was an experiment in 1774 which disproved the whole thing, because somebody figured that if you have a big enough mountain and you hold a pendulum next to the mountain, the mass of the mountain should attract the pendulum by gravitational force. And if only we could do that experiment, see the deflection, we could measure in detail the sort of gravitational field of the Earth. And that was done in 1774 and apparently disproved the hollow Earth once and for all. And yet, it stuck around.
Yeah, well, and then in the early 1900s, Sir Admiral Byrd made his famous journey to the North Pole. And there was some rogue version of his diary where he said he was able to look down into a hole and see another civilization. Jungles, dinosaurs, other kinds of things. Apparently, it was only this diary that was found and attributed to him. He never claimed to have seen or done those things directly himself.
Ah, right.
And that seems to have caused a rebirth in this that really hasn't ever fully gone away.
So what year was that?
I want to say 1903, 1904?
That makes sense, because that then feeds Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World, which I think was 1912. And Edgar Rice Burroughs, of course, had At the Earth's Core, which I think was 1914. So all in that same sort of era. Loads of places underground, usually with monsters or dinosaurs, things that are extinct up here on the surface, but still surviving down below somehow. Yeah. And of course, the granddaddy, as we sort of mentioned, Journey to the Centre of the Earth is probably the most famous Hollow Earth story of all.
Well, also with dinosaurs.
Yes, also with dinosaurs, yeah, strangely. It occurred to me that although not Hollow Earth, there is also still a kind of obsession with things underground in H.G. Wells's The Time Machine, because he has the Morlocks who live underground and sort of come up to the surface and prey on the Eloi. And that was supposedly inspired by the fact that around the time that Wells was writing that, the London Underground was being constructed. So they dug up the streets, put railways down below, and then covered them over again, so that you had subways, underground railways, for the first time. And so Wells's idea was that in the future we would move underground. That would be one future for humankind, is that we would start living underground. And it's a bit like that other weird notion that was around for a while, that we would all live under the sea, which I think we've talked about before. Why would we do that? Did you hear about Cyrus Teed by any chance?
No.
Cyrus Teed sort of turned it on its head. He proposed that the world we see around us, when you look out the window and you see the horizon and the sky, Cyrus Teed proposed that we are actually on the inside of a sphere. So when you look up at the sky, what you're actually doing is you're looking to the centre of the sphere. It's crazy.
It is.
It sort of works if you make some other assumptions. I mean, one thing that wouldn't work is gravity wouldn't work, because we would all fall to the middle if we were on the inside of a sphere. So what he figured was that, well, it has to be a rotating sphere so that we've got centrifugal force that is providing artificial gravity, which takes us back to 2001 again, in a way. But when I thought about that, I figured that can't work, because when you go to the North Pole, if we're on the inside of a sphere, you go to the North Pole, you would be weightless, I think, because you would be at the axis of rotation, so there would be no centrifugal force. So when you go to the North Pole, you would be weightless, and that doesn't happen, and therefore we can't be living inside a sphere. So Cyrus Teed was wrong. But,
yes. So many of these theories are easily disproven with some very basic Andy Weir mathematics and physics.
That's right. It's like the whole flat Earth thing is easily disproved with simple observation.
Yep. And yet, maybe we should do flat Earth next time.
No.
Although I don't know a lot of flat Earth science fiction or fantasy. There's Terry Pratchett's... Oh, my goodness. It's one of the most popular fantasy sets of books out there, and I can't remember the name of it.
I'm not a Pratchett fan, so I can't help you there.
All right. One of our fans will chime in and remind me.
Of course they will. The only flat world I can think of is a book called Flatland, which was written by... was it Abbott? Is that his name? Sort of in Victorian times, 19th century.
The two-dimensional experiment, right?
Yeah, that's right. So it's not really a flat Earth. It's just imagining that the whole universe was two-dimensional rather than three-dimensional. So that's a thought experiment. But it's interesting what you said about the Dyson sphere. In a way, is the hollow Earth, but just on a gigantic scale. And if we take that as the science fiction trope, then that has had a big influence, because you've got things like Larry Niven's Ring World, which isn't a sphere, but it's a part of a sphere. And Bob Shaw also did a series of books, Orbitsville, which was sort of Dyson sphere inspired. So although it's a clanky old 19th century concept, it still has some sort of resonance in modern science fiction, which I find quite fascinating.
Yeah, most of the science fiction that we talk about, everyone knows is false. Yeah. Star Wars, Star Trek, the fantasy genres are obviously not on the Earth. Yeah. But there is this very significant subset: UFOs, hollow Earth, flat Earth, cryptozoology, where there's an active cultural interest in it, so it seems to just persist. Yeah,
that is fascinating, isn't it? And as you say, in particular with the hollow Earth, it goes back all the way into mythology from all over the world. So it presumably is reflecting something quite deep-seated in our psyche, and therefore probably will never go away.
Yeah, I often wonder what comes next. What will imaginations and culture evolve next.
That sounds like a good note on which to end that part of the discussion. How would you like a music quiz, Colin?
I'll take a quiz, you bet.
Are you a musician yourself?
I am. I have been a tuba player for 38 years.
Wow. I often wonder what the repertoire of a tuba player might be. But
It's pretty limited. We do a lot of backup and fundamental work. And I'm a casual musician. I'm not a serious musician.
Ah, okay.
Boy, how would I describe the difference? There are people that just have the ability to pick up an instrument and play music right out of their heart and out of their soul. Yeah. I am more of an operator of the tuba, perhaps. I read notes on a page, and I try to do it as well as I can.
We'll talk more about that in our other podcast, Music 101. But back to science fiction. I've got various film and TV themes here. So I'm going to test you on your musical knowledge of science fiction. Some of these are quite straightforward. Some of them are a bit tricky. But we'll see how we go. We'll start with something quite easy. So in each case, it's quite simple. Can you identify the music? Here's the first one. See if you can identify this.
Yes, that is the piece called Also Sprach Zarathustra, which is the theme song to 2001.
Fantastic. So that was an easy one to get you started. Here's the next one. And I'll give you a clue. This one is from television. So it goes on. Do you know what that one is?
I do not know what that one is, but let me see if I can pick a year.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to say the 1970s.
Yeah, and what gives you that clue?
It's the combination of brass instruments and electric guitar.
Yeah, it's that wacka wacka guitar sound, isn't it?
Wacka wacka, yeah.
That is from Space 1999. And that's season 1, to be specific, because in season 2 they use something totally different.
Oh, wow.
But, yeah, I always found that a weird theme tune, because the beginning of it is spectacular and orchestral, and then it turns into this really dated mid-70s sort of pre-disco sound. Terrible, terrible. Now, what about this one? This one goes back in time, and this is from a film.
That was a beautiful theremin introduction.
Yeah.
I'm going to go with The Day the Earth Stood Still.
Spot on. Absolutely right, yes. So that one's from Bernard Herrmann's score for The Day the Earth Stood Still, yes. Can you remember the name of the story that film is based on?
Farewell to the Master.
I think that's right, yes. It's by Harry Bates. Bonus points for that. Let's see if you get this one. This is another one which is adapted. Let's see if you recognise this. So it goes on. Do you recognise that one?
No, but I'm going to guess This Island Earth.
Oh, interesting. but no. You have to kind of picture the visuals that go with this. So perhaps if I give you a clue as to the visuals, we see a vehicle. You actually hear that music at the very beginning of the film, and you see a vehicle. It's a red vehicle. It's a road vehicle. It has a load of firemen hanging off the vehicle.
This is... No. Really?
Yeah. What do you
Fahrenheit 451.
Indeed, Fahrenheit 451. Out of context, it sounds ridiculous, and I've always said that. It sounds like a piece of, I don't know, children's music or something. In context in the film, it's still a bit strange, but when it's got the visuals with it, you kind of accept it, I think. But yeah, it's a very odd piece of music in many ways. Again, by Bernard Herrmann. He's had quite a hand in science fiction film over the years.
Maybe he's the John Williams of his era.
Oh, maybe. Here's another one for you, a bit more, moving forward in time from there. See if you recognise this one. Again, this is from an adapted science fiction story.
Is this a work by the composer John Carpenter?
It is, although he didn't write that music.
Oh, okay. I'm still going to go with The Thing then.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is John Carpenter's The Thing. And, you said, I think you said composer John Carpenter. So what do you know about John Carpenter and music?
He has written a lot of the soundtracks for his movies.
That's right, yeah. Which is unusual, isn't it? Very few filmmakers who also do the soundtrack. The only other one I could think of, in fact, is Charlie Chaplin, who wrote the scores for a number of his films in the sound era. But that one, I think, if I remember rightly, the music for The Thing is by Ennio Morricone.
Oh, okay.
And the thing I always thought weird about it is John Carpenter, as you say, usually does the music to his own films, and for that film he went to another composer and commissioned a piece of music that sounds like John Carpenter wrote it. Why would you bother?
Yeah, I mean, even when Jonathan Nolan works with Hans Zimmer, it does sound like Nolan style music, but it's definitely Hans Zimmer.
Now here's another one for you. This is the last one of the conventional themes, and then we'll move into something slightly different for the last couple. So see if you recognise this one.
Is that from The Running Man?
It is, yes indeed, The Running Man. That's another one that sounds very dated.
It has that late 80s, early 90s vibe to it.
Yeah, actually I think it's Harold Faltermeyer, who I think might also have written The Heat Is On, the Glenn Frey hit. So yeah, very, very dated, very of its time. Now just to finish off, got a couple of short pieces where I'm just going to play you a few notes and see if you recognise these from the notes. So it's
okay.
Name that tune in 5 to begin with. So can you name this film theme in 5 notes?
Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Spot on. Probably the most iconic film theme of all time, with the possible exception of Jaws, which is recognisable from about 2 notes, I think.
Yes, it depends on how fast you play them next to one another.
Yeah. I don't know if you heard the story that when John Williams first played the music to Jaws to Steven Spielberg, he played it on a piano, and Spielberg thought he was joking because he said, "Here's the theme, Steven," and he just plays these 2 notes. And Spielberg says, "What? Are you sure?" Right, and then this one, make it a little bit harder. Just going to play you 3 notes here. So do you recognise this piece of music?
That is the theme song to Star Trek The Next Generation.
Would you like to guess again?
Sorry, that is the theme song to the 1970s Superman movie.
No. What you meant, of course, was Star Trek, the original series, although they did use that fanfare in The Next Generation as well. This is the original series theme.
Oh.
Have a listen to this. But you're right, that fanfare is used in The Next Generation as well. But what I played you was not from Star Trek. I'll just play it again. That's not from Star Trek. What that is the music from the 1951 film Captain Horatio Hornblower. And this is it in context. Isn't that fascinating?
That is. There's quite a bit of study about John Williams' work, about how he has borrowed themes from the history of music to work into the music he's written for Star Wars and other movies.
Yeah.
And there are great YouTube videos that do musical comparisons like that, and they're very interesting.
Yeah. And what I found fascinating about this is, I discovered this a few years ago, but what's quite fascinating is that Gene Roddenberry, when he created Star Trek, said it was a bit like Captain Hornblower in space. And Nicholas Meyer, when he was taken on to direct Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, he said that he saw Star Trek as being like Hornblower. And presumably Alexander Courage, who wrote the Star Trek theme tune, also thought of Hornblower because he nicked the first 3 notes, that fanfare from the 1951 film. Or is it coincidence? Who knows?
Who knows?
It's remarkably similar. And in fact, it's not just the notes, it's the instrumentation. So it really sounds like it's been borrowed there. But well done, Colin. You got nearly all of the musical items there, except the one I threw in to deliberately trip you up.
And it worked.
And it worked. And you also stumbled on Fahrenheit 451, but I think that's forgivable.
Nice.
Shall we talk about past, present and future?
Yeah.
Have you got any past items for us this time?
Yes. For my other podcast, we're going to be reviewing The Invisible Man and the adaptations which span 50, 60, 70 years, including the Alien Voices adaptation of it. And I'm not sure if you're aware of this or not. Alien Voices was the full cast voice company made up of Star Trek actors.
Yeah. Leonard Nimoy and the guy who played Q, I forgot his name.
John Delancey,
yeah. And I think there were some others as well.
Yeah, he actually plays the part of Griffin in this adaptation, and he does a very good job of it.
Yeah. And that's, on the face of it, that's a weird thing to do, isn't it? To do The Invisible Man in audio only, because all the characters are invisible in audio. And yeah, it does work very nicely.
Yeah, it's amazing. And so I would recommend, since this is coming out in October, that people go back and read some of the famous great movie and science monster movie adaptations that have been made. Go read Frankenstein or Dracula or The Invisible Man or any of a number of other ones from the 1800s or early 1900s.
Yeah, yeah. It's a lot of people don't think of The Invisible Man as being a monster, but of course the character is pretty monstrous. The things he does.
Oh yeah.
And of course, the character became part of that sort of 1930s movie monster sort of universal. I don't know if The Invisible Man was a universal film, but around the time of Frankenstein, Dracula, the Wolfman, The Invisible Man, all of those were sort of lumped together in the sort of public consciousness as monstrous figures.
Yep. Yeah, he was a universal movie monster.
He was,
so to
okay.
say.
Yeah, yeah. So have you reread the novel recently?
I have, and I had never read it before, and it was interesting. My first experience with The Invisible Man would have been, I think, the science fiction series with Vincent Ventresca. From the 90s? Yeah, from the 90s.
Okay,
and so I've been working my way backwards.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know that one. I remember the 1970s series, which starred David McCallum, which had some very primitive visual effects. The whole thing was shot on film, but whenever they did the invisibility effects, they shot on video, and you could see the change in quality of the image, and it was pretty ghastly. I think the storytelling was okay from what I remember, but the visual effects were weird. I've got a couple of past items this time. I mentioned earlier that I would return to 2001. Well, last time I talked about going on a 2001 spree. I read a making of book, and then I reread the novel, and I rewatched the film. Since we recorded last time, I rewatched 2010, the sequel to 2001, and quite frankly, I think it's pretty awful. Well, it's not a bad film, it's just incredibly average. And although I've seen it several times before, and some viewings I found 2010 to be moderately impressive, this time I watched it with 2001 very fresh in my mind, and when you do that, 2010 looks terrible. It looks like a really cheap rip-off of the original, which is a shame, because it does have some strengths, but it's not a great film by any means. The other thing I looked at was, again, this is a reread, is there's a book from the time of the making of 2010, a book called The Odyssey File, which basically is the email correspondence between Arthur C. Clarke and the film director Peter Hyams. And I remember when that book came out, I found it quite fascinating to be able to see this behind-the-scenes interplay between the author and the filmmaker. But looking back at that book now, it looks like a really cheap way of making a book. It's just, let's gather together the emails and we'll put them in a book. And I felt ripped off, even though I'd bought the book about 30 years ago. So I've got my money's worth out of it, but it felt like a real cheat of a book. So I don't recommend that, and I don't recommend 2010, quite frankly. In terms of things I can say something positive about, I had reason this afternoon to pull off my shelf an old book called Fantastic Lives, subtitled Autobiographical Essays by Notable Science Fiction Writers. And this was edited by Martin H. Greenberg in, I'm just looking through for the date, 1981. And I've had this book probably for a couple of decades now, and it sat on the shelf and I haven't looked at it for a long time, and I just had cause to look in it today, and I was reminded of the contents of it. It is literally very short autobiographical essays, some of them by people who are still quite well known today. So Harlan Ellison is in there, Philip Jose Farmer is in there, A.E. Van Vogt is in there, who's not as famous as he once was, but he's still known, I think. But what's interesting is some of the people who've slipped more into obscurity but are still in there. And today I was reading the essay by Margaret St. Clair, who's an author who is almost forgotten now. She wrote dozens of novels and probably a few hundred short stories, very, very successful in the pulp era. And yet, as I say, almost forgotten today. I doubt if any of her books are currently in print. But it was quite fascinating to read or reread her autobiographical sketch where she's talking about how she came to write science fiction. And she started off writing detective stories for pulp magazines. And then she tried her hand at science fiction and was successful at selling a story. So she wrote another one. And I think this is true of a lot of people of that era, sort of 1930s, 1940s. A lot of authors were drawn to the field simply because it was one of many fields in which they could sell short stories, because short stories were the thing that you could make money from. So it's quite fascinating to reread that. There's also, in the same book, there's one by Catherine MacLean, who is another writer who is almost forgotten today. If you look in anthologies of classic science fiction stories, you'll sometimes find a Catherine MacLean story in there. But I don't think you'll find any of her books on sale anywhere these days. So that's it. It's a strange little hardback book called Fantastic Lives, but because it is now so old, the book is now, well, it's from 1981, so what's that, 40 years old.
Yeah.
And the people represented in the book stretch back another 40 years, if you like. So it's a book that I think is more valuable now than it was when it was published, in many ways. So there's my little past item for you.
Yeah. Sometime on a future episode, we'll have to talk about the value of reading old science fiction versus recent science fiction.
I think that is a good topic. We should do that. And I think partnered with that, we should perhaps take an old pulp magazine that maybe has a story that is well known today, but also read the stories around it in the same issue of the magazine. So, for instance, if you took a well-known Asimov story and found it in an old issue of Astounding Science Fiction, and then read the other stories in that same issue, it's interesting to compare the one that has survived through to the modern age with other stories that were published alongside it at the time.
Huh.
I've done that a few times, and because you think that all of these stories were published, they must have all been equally good. But of course, some stories stand the test of time and others don't. Yeah, so there's a couple of ideas there for future episodes. We should follow up on that.
Yeah.
What about present science fiction? Do you have any news of present things?
Oh, there are so many things happening. I don't know if it's the season. For a certain part of science fiction, especially where it's related to television media, it is the season. In the United States, it's the beginning of the television season. So all these new things are starting to come out and be released.
Yeah.
The Foundation series has been released to wide acclaim. Some positive, some negative. Star Wars released their Visions anime anthology, and I watched that, and it was an experience. It was a learning experience.
Yeah.
I don't watch a lot of anime, and so I'm not used to the art styles. I'm not used to the storytelling. They seem to have a Sith fetish. They really like dark Jedi Siths. Yeah. Whereas in our culture, we tend to celebrate the light. So that was a real revelation, so to say.
Yeah. I think you're right. It is a time of year thing, isn't it? New TV seasons. And even though we, in this era of streaming, we think the idea of the season has gone away to some extent because people can watch whenever they want, there is still a seasonal pattern to when these things are released. So television hasn't changed in that regard.
Right.
Under present, the only item I've brought this time is that the Arthur C. Clarke Award winner was announced a few days ago. Now, the Clarke Award is given to the best novel published in the UK in the previous year. So it doesn't have to be a British novel, but it just has to have been published here. And the winner was a novel called The Animals in That Country by Laura Jane Mackay. She, I believe, is from New Zealand, and the novel, I think, is set in Australia, or at least the beginning of the novel is. And I haven't read the novel, but I went onto Amazon and looked at the Look Inside feature, and I was able to read really a substantial opening chapter of the book, and I found it quite fun. So I think I am going to read it at some point. But that sounds like a good one. I think it's only her second novel, but that's one to look out for. The animals in that country.
Cool.
Any future items?
I am quite excited for the new releases by Brandon Sanderson coming out next year.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote, and I think I've mentioned this in the past, the series is called Mistborn.
Yeah.
And it's part of his larger Cosmere universe. His magic systems are so incredibly detailed and well thought out and scientific in their descriptions and organization. And he decided that for this particular fantasy series, he was going to see what would happen if time progressed significantly. So it starts off being like an epic fantasy. And the second generation of this is like a Western. So they have, revolvers and trains. It's almost a steampunk kind of vibe, but a lot of the technology behind it is driven by this magic system, and it's just really interesting to see. I want to see the next two generations that are coming after this.
Does it tie into that old Arthur C. Clarke notion of any sufficiently advanced science is indistinguishable from magic?
No, this is magic from the get-go. The way it works, and let me just talk about it briefly, is there are certain people who, if they ingest trace amounts of minerals, iron, copper, tin, gold, platinum, it evokes certain abilities.
Ah, okay.
So if I remember right, bronze gives you strength and stamina, and iron gives you the ability to push away on metal. And my friends that I talk about this with all the time are going to be disappointed because I've forgotten all the metal types. But there are 12 different metal types, and they all give you different abilities. And he, works this into the ability to fly and have super strength and speed and a few other things, which I won't mention for people that should check out Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn series and enjoy it.
Excellent. That sounds good. Thank you. I've got a couple of future items which are, again, media-related, TV-related, just a couple of announcements that came out in the last week or so. And they're both about revivals, in a way. I don't know if news of this reached you, where you are, Colin, but the Doctor Who TV series, they've announced who the next showrunner is going to be when Chris Chibnall steps down next year. And it is none other than Russell T Davies, who's the guy who revived Doctor Who in the early 2000s. So the person who is responsible for modern Who is returning, which I personally think is terrific because he is one of the UK's greatest screenwriters. He did some fantastic work after Doctor Who. But I know that there's lots of Doctor Who fans who cannot stand Russell T Davies because it's one of those things where when somebody runs a show for a while, they're the hero, but if they stay too long, they become the villain. And for some people, Russell T Davies was the villain because he, in their view, ran out of ideas, which he never did, in my view. But anyway, but that will be quite fascinating to see the person who basically established modern Doctor Who coming back to it with a new cast as well, so which hasn't been announced yet. We don't know who the cast is going to be. And the other one on similar lines is J. Michael Straczynski has announced that Babylon 5 is being rebooted with him in charge. So
I have heard that.
Yeah, so that sounds really quite interesting. You might think that it would be a sequel, but he has said very specifically, this is not a sequel, this is a reboot. And he's spoken, I think, about how difficult it would be to do a continuation because some of the actors are no longer with us. And that in many ways it's easier to kind of go back to the beginning and start again, but it's not going to be a straightforward retelling. It is going to be a reimagining of the series. So that will be quite interesting to see. I have to say I ran out of steam on Babylon 5. I did watch it from the beginning, and I think I watched it for about 3 years. But it was one of those things that I found a little bit too convoluted in the end. And it always seemed to be a lot of people talking rather than doing stuff, which I think was perhaps because it was of limited budget. But in today's television, maybe there's a bit more money to throw at it, and maybe it's easier to do some things now with visual effects than it was back in the day. So yeah, I look forward to seeing that.
Straczynski said this incredible quote, which is, "You can't walk in the same river twice," and that's a fantastic thought, especially coming from someone who invented this thing to begin with. Mm-hmm. So it'll be interesting to see what he does that is the same and different. I've already kind of heard that they're going to probably drop the first season's storytelling. Because if you watched it, there's kind of the first season, and then they get a new commander in seasons 2, 3, 4, and 5.
Yes. So you think it's going to come in kind of at season 2? Yeah.
The Sinclair storyline was a bit out there, especially the way that it ends.
Should be interesting. I also saw, I think it was a tweet by one of the cast members, and I can't remember which one, but kind of implying that they'd been talking to JMS and that they might have some role in it, even though they may not be playing the same character. So there is some hint that he may have loyalties to his original cast, but he's not necessarily thinking of doing a one-for-one casting, So yeah. that could be interesting as well.
And it's a great idea. It's a good way to provide fan service, to say, hey, I know who that guy is, and I know what he used to do. What is he going to do in here?
Yeah, it could be really good. Thanks for listening, and we hope you'll join us next time. We're Phil Nichols and Colin Kuskie. Our theme tune is from purpleplanet.com. Look for the show notes on our website, 101sf.blogspot.com. And also find us as Science Fiction 101 on Facebook. And finally, please follow us or subscribe to us on your podcast app. You can find us through Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Audible, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.